So on the first page, what questions do we have? Maybe you tried some and you just want to check, not sure where to start, anything like that.
Or even if it's just to refresh your memory if you haven't tried it out. All in one.
So numbers 1 through 4, there's not a whole lot of work to do there because you're just writing another equation that is parallel or perpendicular to those. So if it's parallel, we need to know that the slope is going to be the same or change. Not for parallel.
Parallel must stay the same.
So if it's going to be the same, that means you know what your slope is based off what's given. So you're going to write that same slope, y equals 1/3, and then pick whatever y-intercept you want. It just can't be the exact same.
Because if it is the exact same y-intercept, that just means the same line, the same slope are on top of each other.
Right, and we don't want that. Other questions on this page? Anything you see that you're confused on how to do? Okay, 5 through 8, you're gonna do a similar process using the slope that's given or changing it depending on if it's parallel or perpendicular, and the point that's given. And then you're gonna be using your formula y minus y1 equals m times x minus x. So for 6, we're looking for an equation that is parallel, so the slope is gonna be the same. So if you want to write off to the side, m equals 1/5, just to make sure you know it's gonna be the same, you can, it's not necessary. So then we know our m, we know our y1, we know our x1. This part we're gonna completely ignore, we don't need it. And then put all of those numbers into this equation. Y minus our y1 is -2. Our slope is 1/5. X minus our -5. If you want to change those to pluses right away, you can do that, or if you'd rather wait and do it in the next step, you can do that. So this would be y plus 2 equals 1/5x. Sorry, in parentheses, x plus 5. And then the rest of that process is the same, distribute and get y by itself. I'm running out of space here. So this is still a part of 6, I'm just running out of space. So you can either multiply that fraction in the 5 by hand or in your calculator. And then get y by itself by subtraction. So our equation would be y equals 1/5x minus 1. I'm comparing these two, they are parallel because they have the same slope but different y-intercepts. Other questions on this page?
What about the
Number 8, okay. So same process, but if it's perpendicular, the slope is going to change. So take this and flip it. It's already positive, so this has to be negative. And then again, we're gonna ignore this 5, use this point. So I'm gonna write this in 7 spot. Y minus -5 or y plus 5 equals -7 times x minus 1. Then we can distribute, make a plus. and get y by itself by subtracting 5 to both sides.
Go back up to number 4, how do you do that again?
We'll go back to that. So the equation that is perpendicular to the original is y equals negative 7x plus 2.
You said number 4.
With those, since it's perpendicular, your slope is going to change.
And what exactly does change if we need a perpendicular slope? So for example, if we have 1/2 as a slope, how would we change it to make it perpendicular? 2/1, so we just split the fraction, and then what else?
Make it negative. Yeah. So then what would the new slope for this one be? Correct. So y equals positive 5/4 x, pick whatever y intercept you want, can be the same, can be different, doesn't matter. And then do you have this review? Other questions on this page? Three. So we have to know the slope of this line. What is the slope of x equals 6? Think about your toy box. It's an x equals, what's the slope gonna be? Up and down, or is it left? So here we have x equals, this is gonna tell us what our slope is, what does that represent? The u.
That's 0 or undefined.
Undefined. But because it's perpendicular, we need the opposite slope. What slope is opposite of undefined? 0. So that means it has to be a y equals. The only type of equation with a 0 slope is a y equals. So it's gonna be y equals whatever number you want. It can be the same, it can be different, doesn't matter. So if that was in your parallel, they would look similar with different numbers. Like if it was x equals 6 up here, you would say x equals some other number. Those would be parallel. Other questions on this page? Nine. For 9, I would suggest finding your slope and your y-intercept of what's given first. That'll help you find A and B. So here we have a y-intercept at -4. And our slope, if we're looking for where does this line cross grid line point exactly? It looks like it's at +2/1 or just 2. So then for A, the slope has to be the same. So it's gonna be 2. Y equals 2x, put whatever y-intercept you want. This has to be different. For B, use this slope, but change it. What would that new slope be? Not -2.
1/2.
-1/2. And then x, whatever y-intercept you want. It could be the same, it could be different, doesn't matter. So that one's similar to 1, 2, 3, and 4, just in a different format. Other questions on this page? If not, we're gonna move on to your line of best fit page. Questions on that page?
Okay.
10. So with 10 is asking which of these is this equation the most likely line of best fit? Well, this has a positive slope. So if these dots are going down and to the right or up and to the left, it can't do that. So it can't be B, it can't be D. So it has to be A or C. So then we just have to figure out which. You could draw this line on both and see which one it matches up to. So our slope is 3, so go up 3 to the right one, down 3 to the left one. 1, 2, 3. Which of those do the points surround better? C. Other questions on the stage? Allison? 11. So we're gonna put this data into your calculator, reset your calculator, second plus 712. And then we're gonna follow the instructions step by step. So starting with step 1, go into stat, edit 1 or enter, and put in your data. The age is going to, sorry, the time is gonna depend on age. So age is gonna be in L1, time is gonna be in L2. Do you have the instructions from the language that we use? If you don't have out your instructions, make sure you take those out. On this list, we're just gonna point you to step 1, step 2, step 3 on that page. For the instructions. Other reviews. Following step 2 on your instruction page, you're gonna go back to stat. Scroll to the right to calculate. Scroll down to number 4 and hit enter, or just hit number 4. Bless you. Scroll down to store regression equation. And hit alpha trace. And then enter until your screen changes.
And then reconsider on.
Right? Even though the question does not ask you to write the line of best fit, write this down. So that if you get the wrong answer, I can see, did you get the wrong equation and that's why your answer is wrong, or was it something else? You can round the two decimal places if it doesn't say, to negative 12.13 plus x 272.27. So write that somewhere near your problem. Then the question is asking to find the length of time it should take Marcia's 6-year-old niece to run 1 lap. They give us X, we have to find Y, so we're gonna go back, and this is now your step 3. And we're gonna store 6 for X, so just hit 6. STO X, enter. After you store 6 for X, alpha trace. And then enter twice. Now it's asking which is the closest. This number that it gives is not one of your answer choices, but round up, don't round down, because 200 would be closer than 190. So 200 would be our answer then. For number 12, make sure you change the years. So the first one is always 0. Every year after that is how many years has it been since the original. And then also remember that interpolation is inside the data, extrapolation is outside the data.
I'm so sorry, how do you do step 3 then?
Whatever the number is, 6, then STO, and then X, and then enter. And then alpha trace, and enter twice. Okay, thank you. Yes, all right. Other questions on this page? I'm gonna have a good rest of the day and we can. With a little bit of time we have left. What questions do we have on the last page? And then if we need to, we'll finish when we get back. Right, so with 14, find what's important. And then with the things that are given, you have to decide, what did they give you? Pick out important information and decide what is they giving. So like 1575, what is that?
Word that's right after 1575 then for
And that tells you what?
So if it's got like per hour, for example, how's that gonna look like if you write it down? They're gonna want the whole number, or it's gonna look like a fraction. A fraction, yeah. Per just means fraction. So like, for example, this is just the cost per hour. Or cost per orange.
So that would represent what variable?
What's the only thing that we have as a fraction when we have an equation right now? A slope, good.
We have three other things. What do those represent?
Why?
Which one is the y?
Our the total cost, could say.
Total cost.
Yeah.
Is your y. So then we are looking at what does 25 deposit represent and what do the hours represent? In a normal equation, we have y equals mx plus b.
The X would be the hour.
X would be the hours. How many hours would this be?
4.
So then 25 is gonna be our,
Lives.
Yes. Yeah, and like especially if it says in addition to 25 deposit. So when we see an addition, that's telling us, hey, we're gonna also add this to this group and what we got so far per hour.
we'll finish that one when we get back. So we found all of our parts. We're gonna put those together in the equation. Y equals mx plus b, but instead of those letters, we're gonna put our numbers that we know. So we don't know our y. We know our m. We know our x. We know our b. That's gonna be your equation. Your solution is gonna be whatever this is. Figure that out. So multiply that by 4, add 25. What do you get? $88. And then whatever your solution is, make sure you have your label. So here we're looking for total costs, so our label would be dollars. Other questions on this page? All right, 15, which one are you gonna say? I'm gonna say 15 is similar. So after we find all the pieces and parts, we can set it up and then we'll move on. So for 15, we know it costs $4.95 per game. We know there's a one-time fee to rent shoes. And that she played 5 games and paid $32. And we have to find the cost to rent shoes. So of the things given, what do each piece represent, or what variable does each piece represent? If nothing else, look for the slope first. Look for that word per. Allison? So that would be your slope. What do the other things represent? Right. Not B, that would be your right answer. That's gonna be how much you paid for everything.
The game could be your X.
Remember, game's just gonna be your X. So we still need B and we need Y. What would those two be?
Your wild food. The cost of the shoes.
That goes back with one-time B, so those two things are connected. Which one is your total?
32.
32. That's gonna be your Y. So then the one-time fee is. What's missing?
Your
Your B. So if you wanna put that here or for this one. Those are both B. You wouldn't have two Bs, it's the same thing, just one is asking for it, one is talking about it. Yeah. I'm sorry, not that one. It was supposed to be, cause this is underlined. Because this is talking about a one-time fee to rent shoes, that is related to the cost to rent shoes, we don't know what that is. But are you gonna pay to rent shoes multiple times? No, that's gonna be a one-time thing, anytime it's a one-time thing, that's your B. Okay. So then we would put all of that information together, our Y is 32. Our M is 4.95. We know our X is 5, we don't know our B. That would be the equation you write in the equation box. And now we have to solve for B. So that's it. So what would our B be? That's why I pause. What value would we get there, or what did we get for B? Why would you get? $3 exactly. When you subtracted these two. I'm trying to. It's 32 minus 10, 475.
It's 7.25.
Again,
7.25.
what is our label?
Dollars.
Dollars.
Other questions on this page?
I will say that 16, you can use your line of best fit instructions to do this. Because this would be your X1, Y1, X2, Y2. You're not given a slope, you're not given a B, you're given two sets of points. So you can use your line of best fit stuff or do this algebraically, find your slope. And then use that to find your B. And use that equation to find your answer. We have time to go over one more, but I'll say this, here, this is one we did the other day. Where it's talking about two different things. So that's gonna be your standard form, AX plus BY equals C, yeah. So of these two, which one do we want to see, go over, have questions about? 17, okay. So if we have nickels and dimes. You have to write in the A and the B, the worth of both. So A, your nickel would be worth 5 cents. B, your dime would be worth 10 cents. This is my worth, I just wrote it really small. Your C is always gonna be your total, which is what here? Is that your total? And then we're given 66 and number of dimes. 66 has to go with A. So would that be X or Y if the equation has to be AX plus BY? X. How would we write this equation?
$0.05 times 66 plus 0.7. Why?
One thing
Equals C.
equals
Equals,
70. So on this board over here, I'm gonna write, that the ABC, the AX plus BY equals C. So you would multiply this together and start solving for Y. This would be the equation you put down here. I just, yeah, divide by 10. So what would your answer be? What do you get? 45, that is the answer. And then here we're looking for number of dimes, so 45 dimes. And then if you're not sure, you can always put that back in, put 45 in for y and see does this equal 780. If it does, you did the right thing. If it doesn't,
Somewhere along the lines you messed up.
I want to give you ample time to do your quiz. Do we have any general questions before I make you put your stuff away?
What formula is for number 16? You said, it was.
You can use the same instructions for this.
Are you waiting?
Yes. So if you want to just use that and put it in your calculator, you would just say use line of best fit. And that you stored this for x. Or you would find your slope. Find your slope and then use this to find your equation. And then use that to find this.
So you have a choice. Do you want to do everything algebraically or put it in your calculator? That is your choice.
I'm gonna put that on the board. Clear off your desk except for your instructions, your calculator instructions. If you need to rip that page off, you can. I need all cell phones in a calculator pocket. If you have a smartwatch, take that off, put it in your bag or put it with your phone.